I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia and Young Harris College. Our guest today is a legend in Georgia politics, Senator Wayne Garner. Welcome, Wayne.
Thank you, Bob. I'm glad to be here. I appreciate the invitation and the chance to get to see an old friend and reminisce about all the things that's gone on in the past.
Well, we're anxious for you to share with us some of your memories, beginning with your election to the Senate in 1980. I might add at the tender age of 28.
That's correct.
But before we do, please tell us about your early life over there in West Georgia.
Well, I was actually born in Atlanta at the old St. Joseph Hospital in 1951 in May. And we lived in a little bitty house over on Carr Street. I still remember the address. It was 992 Carr Street, right off of Rice Avenue, across Bankhead Highway from the old Maddox Park. We lived there. Daddy worked at Atlantic Steel, and I had two older brothers, and we were all poor, but we didn't know it. So we moved around a good bit, moved to Douglasville. My mother died of cancer when I was 10, and my two older brothers, I think they were like 13 and 15 when she passed away. We lived in rural Douglas County, then moved to Lithia Springs, and my dad was an alcoholic, and so he had his troubles, and my two older brothers went in the service to escape all that. Well, I wasn't quite old enough to go in the service then, but kind of hung around there, lived. Then we moved into the mill village there in Douglasville, and I left home, had me a job at a drugstore. I was in junior high school. Well, I was in high school. I was in '67, I guess. And Mr. Whitley, who owned the funeral home, he was one of our customers, and I was even in an early age sort of a conniver and a deal maker. And I asked him, I said, "Do you have a job out there where I could work and live?" He said, "Yeah, I do. I'd like to have you." Said, "You can go to school, work in the afternoon." Said, "There's a room out there. You can have your own room." And so I went home that night. I quit the drugstore, told Gwen Mara, who was a pharmacist and sort of almost like a father figure. I said, "Well, Gwen, I'm going to leave you. I got to find me a place to stay, and where the lights are on and the heat works, and so I can get to school." And so I walked home and put all my stuff in two Big Apple paper sacks, the Big Apple grocery store, and I walked across Douglasville that night to the funeral home and moved in with Mr. and Ms. Whitley and stayed there through high school, because I was just about beginning the 11th grade, so 10th grade, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. Stayed there, and then went on to West Georgia College, and later on bought that funeral home and operated it. So that, pretty much just a thumb sketch. I mean, we just, like I said, was a very poor family. We had hogs and gardens, and I think I lived, my wife and I counted from the time I was born till I married her, I lived in 27 different houses, just moving around. But didn't know any better. So if you've never had it, you can't miss it. So then I married my wife Jerry. We've been married now about 36 years. In October of '74. Had our first child at 77. Always had an interest in politics. We helped when Jimmy Carter ran for president, and I remember being invited to the Democratic Charter Convention in Macon, which would have been in about '75, by a little-known state representative in Cartersville named Joe Frank Harris, and he and Ms. Harris drove to Douglasville and picked Jerry and I up, and we rode to Macon, and were invited to a reception at the old Macon Hilton to go up and meet Jimmy Carter and Rosalynn, and they were beginning their candidacy to run for president. and we were up there, and I think that whole afternoon there's only 5 or 6 people in the room. Dot Paget, who you remember from out in Douglasville, and Joe Frank and Elizabeth and myself and Jerry, maybe a handful of others. So very few people came because I think, no one had any idea that Mr. Carter would be able to pull that off, but he did. And so that sort of wet my whistle for politics, and I always just sort of thought I might run for something one day. And in January of '80, I was getting ready to go on a duck hunt down on the Altamaha River down near Brunswick. And that night I got up the next morning and found out that our state senator, Eb Duncan, had died of heart issues. So I'll go on the duck hunt, and I was down there thinking in the duck blind. I said, well, I think I'll just go back and run for that. So I did. And I believe there were 7 people in the race, and we wound up in a runoff with Tom Glanton, great guy who was a former House member, had resigned, and he got in the race. Well, Tom and I wound up in the runoff, and that district was basically Newnan, in that northern part of Coweta County, all of Carroll, and about half of Douglas. Well, having been grown up in Douglasville and worked at the funeral home and all, I had a good base there. Hadn't been in Carrollton very long. But nonetheless, we got to run off with Tom, and we led the ticket. And I was getting political advice from a character in Mableton by the name of Jerry Landers. And he and Roy Barnes lived right behind each other, next to each other. And then a guy in Marietta named Wade Scholes, who was an assistant school superintendent, and on the side ran some campaigns, because I didn't know anything about it. So they advised me, said, you just stay away from him. Don't get in a debate with him. And I said, well, don't you think I should? And they said, no, you do not need to get in a debate with him, because you do not even know where the Capitol is. He may ask you what floor is the Senate chamber on, and you don't have a clue. So I never debated him. We just had some joint appearances, but at any rate, and in 3 weeks we won by about 62%. And it was true, I'd never been to state capitol. I had to call and get directions to get over here to get sworn in. And that was when then Lieutenant Governor Miller was, I believe, was running against Herman Talmadge. And Al Holloway was sort of taking over the duties for the Lieutenant Governor while he was out. So I came over, and Lieutenant Governor Miller was at my swearing in and all that. But when it came time for committee assignments, Al made the assignments. And I remember meeting with him because, Lord God, I was 28 years old and just didn't know a thing. And he asked me what I was interested in, and I said, well, I'd just like to be on a committee where I could just sort of learn the process. And he said, well, that'd be Culver Kids Committee. So he put me on Culver's committee. And
Government operations.
Governmental operations, the best committee in the Senate. And used to be, I heard, was the OE-Reg committee, where Culver actually had subpoena powers, I think. And I think they watered that down and took it away from it. So that began, that's how I got over there, and stayed in the Senate for about 13 years. Then went on the parole board, and then was there during Governor Miller's campaign, I guess his re-election campaign against Milner.
1990?
Yeah, that's right. Well,
let's don't get too far away
from that. Ain't right. So that's sort of how I got here. Just an amazing, fun journey.
Good. Well, before we get too far away from it, tell us about Culver Kid. His name pops up everywhere we go.
Culver Kid was just a wily character, probably one of the smartest people I think I've ever met. I mean, he could keep more in his head, and he took his business very serious. I mean, but he didn't take himself too serious, which is good. But he had 2 goals. One was money and jobs to Milledgeville. That was his main function in life, to see how much he could help Central State. And I mean, they knew him and loved him for that. But he was a colorful character. Zell and made me his babysitter. I had to sit next to Culver, but I learned so much from him. And he would just do the craziest things. I remember one day I heard a beeping sound in the Senate chamber, and I looked over, and this inflatable robot was coming down the center aisle. Culver over there with a remote control, because he had dubbed, he'd gotten mad at Zell about something, called him a robot for Joe Frank Harris, so he had this little robot delivering a message. Zell got mad as hell. And sometimes in the afternoon, Culver would come back from lunch, and he would like to have an occasional gimlet at lunch. Well, this time he had maybe one too many, and he was trying to be recognized to make a speech or respond on a bill, and Zell knew that he didn't probably need to get in the well, so he wasn't recognizing. So in the Senate, they get these microphones on these wires. You'd pull them out, and that'd trigger something, and Zell wouldn't recognize him. Well, Culver gets his microphone on the end of the cord and starts, and I'm having to duck, and he's screaming out, "Oh, great leader, oh, great leader." And finally, Zell looked at him and said, "Senator, I'm bending as far backwards to accommodate you as you are leaning sideways to talk to me." So that ended that, and I finally got Culver to sit down. But then he had his office, the Oasis, as you recall the Oasis, and it was up on the 4th floor. Joe Andrews, who was a lobbyist for the Georgia industrial loan, the small loan folks, he was up there, and he was the bartender. And every afternoon, I mean, the press, members of the Senate, Bobby Parham over in the House, Pete McDuffie from DNR, and everybody just gathered in Culver's office and had a cocktail in the afternoon about 5 o'clock, and it was just nothing nothing thought about it. Sometimes we'd get so many in there, if it was late in the session, we wouldn't have a quorum on the floor, and Zell would call up there, raising Cane, wanting us to get out of the bar and come back down on the floor of the Senate. But he was really something else. But he had a real soft spot for those that didn't have a voice in government. I remember going through the hospitals with him at Central State, and I mean, he was so involved. Even a lot of the patients knew him, and if anybody had a problem down there, they just went to Culver.
Let's talk for a minute, Wayne, about that race in 1980 between Miller and Senator Talmadge. What do you remember about that?
Well, there's a funny story about that, because like I told you, when I got elected to the Senate, like I said, never been to the Capitol, and that race was during the winter, and I got sick. I got pneumonia. I was just out working so hard, and finally when the race was over, I was just exhausted. The only thing I'd ever in my life heard about the Talmadges were they were just gods. My daddy, this Herman Talmadge and Gene Talmadge, I mean, they talked, my daddy liked politics, and he talked about the Talmadge people and how wonderful they were and all this, that, and other. So I'd never met Herman Talmadge, never heard from him, so this sort of sets that up. Finally, election night about 2 o'clock, everybody finally left the house. I got in bed and went to sleep. And my phone rung about 5:30 in the morning, and I picked it up, and his voice said, "Senator Garner, Herman Talmadge here. I want to congratulate you on a fine victory." And I said, "Right," and I just hung up. I thought one of my friends was playing a joke on me. Well, the phone rung back, and it was this lady. She said, "You did hang up on Senator Herman Talmadge. He'd like to talk to you." And I got on the phone, and I said, "Well, Senator, I'm so sorry. I mean, I had no idea you'd call me. Gosh." And he said, "Well, congratulations." Said, "You've done a good job." Said, "I want you to get busy and help me beat Zell." Said, "He's giving me hell all over the state." And I said, "Well, all right, I didn't know what to say," so I hung up. And but I remember that race. I remember watching those the debates when they would. I remember Zell would propose some program at lunch, and then at the debate, the next meeting, Talmadge would have this big post. You remember that as to how much it was going to cost. Yeah. But that was a rough and tumble. It was tumble race, and I think, you know, in the end, maybe justly or unjustly, Governor Miller got credited probably for wounding Herman so bad that Mac Mattingly was able to beat him. But I know when Mac Mattingly beat Herman Talmadge, I had to go put my daddy in the hospital in Villa Rica. I mean, he was physically sick that Herman had been defeated. But it was a rough, you know, it was just a tough race. But I know later on they made amends and
So you got elected to the Senate. Come over here to the Capitol. Walk us through your first day.
Well, the first day, I remember, because I'd gotten elected, like I said, on April Fool's Day in 1980. Dot Paget said, when you get over there on your first day, there's been another young man down in South Georgia by the name of Paul Trulock that's been elected to the Senate. He said, she said, you look him up, and I think y'all will be great friends and comrades. So that was the first day I got over here and went over and introduced myself to Paul. That's been 30 years ago, and we to this day talk 2 or 3 times a week. We have our mountain cabins are within a mile of each other. We've been all over the world together with our wives, and so I guess that first day is where I met Trulock and began to meet some other members of the Senate, and sitting there still kind of scratching my head is how did I get from 992 Carr Street to the Senate. Then shortly after that I realized everybody there was about the same. Everybody had their different stories. Then I made friends with Paul, and then Roy Barnes, and I had been friends even prior to that. His neighbor Jerry Landers helped me, and Roy, I used to call him for advice. I mean, one of the big issues back then was the ratification of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. And my opponent was for that, and I didn't even know what it was. And I asked Roy, I said, what's this ERA stuff? So he kind of told me. He said, I said, well, my opponent's for it. I guess maybe I ought to be against it. I said, have you got any good reasons why I could be against it? So Roy, you know, he didn't care what side it was. So he gave me a list of things that was, and that ended up sort of being the conservative right philosophy. So I met Roy and Pierre. Gang of Five. And that was Trulock, and then that was in the later year. It was Ed Hine, Pierre Howard, Roy Barnes, myself, and Trulock. And the press dubbed us the Gang of Five. We were the Young Turks, and we spent an entire summer crafting legislation, sort of populist, like campaign finance disclosure, just on and on and on. And we had a stack of it, and we introduced it on the first day of that session, and it was promptly all defeated and killed in committee. But interestingly enough, everything we proposed became law within 6 or 7 years, just under different names, as they began to look at what you do with leftover campaign funds. That was one of the proposals from the Gang of Five, and we said, you know, you either give it back or you give it to a charity. You can't declare it income, because you remember back those days you could. I remember congressmen, when they changed that law, a lot of them didn't run that year because they had $500,000 in their campaign account that they could declare as income. And that was one of the things. Other thing was like retirement bills. We had a piece of legislation that says this, it wasn't law then, but it's law now, that a retirement bill can't pass in 1 year. You got to introduce it 1 year and pass it the second. Because as you recall, those retirement bills had come out of committee, and on the last night of the session, they really could get some strange amendments put to them. And so that's now law. That was something the Gang of Five proposed. Campaign finance disclosure is now law, and that was something the Gang of Five proposed, and several other things.
You know, the rumor at the time was that the Gang of Five ran into Hugh Gillis.
we ran into Hugh Gillis, and I think Zell dispatched Hugh to kill all that, because Hugh was quoted in the paper, said that it's been taken care of.
Tell us about Senator Gillis.
He was quite a character. I really got to know and respect and like Hugh. He sat right in front of Culver and myself, and we would all huddle. And you know, I mean, there were generational differences, because, you know, I was 28 and he had been up here longer than I had been living, and but we got along well and liked it. You know, if you sit next to somebody or in the same room with somebody for 40 days, I mean, you really get to know that person. I sat next to Render Hill before they made me go sit next to Culver, and we just became wonderful friends. And you know, through that experience, I mean, I think back on I don't guess there's a county that I don't know somebody. And I get calls living in Carrollton, across the street from the University of West Georgia. A lot of children from around the state, and a lot of people call and say, Wayne, you know, just like last year, I got a call early one morning from Trip Martin. His son was in the fraternity out there, and they'd had one of the fraternity brothers gotten killed in an automobile accident that night. And he woke me up and he said, will you go out there and be with him? And so I called our preacher, and it's just that kind of relationship all over the state that you enjoy, having just served with those folks. I sat next to Judge Quillian Baldwin, and one thing I tell my son, who has started his own governmental affairs, he worked with Zell in Washington for the whole time he was there, and he said, well, Dad, you got any pointers? I said, the only pointer I can give you is you treat everybody fair and be respectful, because you never know, number one, it's the right thing to do, but you never know where they'll wind up. And he learned that lesson last year. We had a piece of legislation we were working on, and David Ralston was going to carry it for us, so we had to walk 40 miles over here to find David after he had been defeated as Speaker. And 2 weeks later, he was Speaker of the House. So
never know.
You never know.
That's right. Do you remember the first bill you introduced?
I'm trying to recall. I think the first resolution, first thing I introduced was a resolution honoring and commending Senator Duncan, and had his family up and all that sort of stuff. I remember the first. I don't think I introduced a bill the first year. I did. The second year I introduced the first bill, and it dealt with a criminal issue. We had a young girl that was killed in Carrollton by another teenager. And the law prevented his name from being in the paper, because you couldn't print the name of juvenile offenders. But it didn't apply to victims. So her name was in the paper, and it was not the best set of circumstances, and it really hurt the family. So I put a bill in there. If you're going to exclude the criminal, you should not be able to identify the victim. I passed it in the Senate, and it got over into the House Judiciary Committee, and I had to go before the House Judiciary Committee, and one infamous representative, Mr. Denmark Groover from Macon, got my bill and looked at it, and he said, young man, you're to be commended. Said it would take a genius to get a bill this unconstitutional halfway through a legislature. Said, but it stops here, so I just, okay, I try. But then Denny and I, from that, I got to meet him and know and love him, and learn of all his goings on and his
grooverizing.
Grooverizing, yes. He could read a bill and just tell you everything was in it in just a second.
Well, Senator, you served with 3 Georgia governors, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right, Governor Busby,
Joe Frank Harris, and Governor Miller.
And Governor Barnes.
And Governor Barnes, so it's 4.
4, yeah. I stayed, because I had planned to leave when Senator Miller left, because the job he had me in, you had to have a strong support system, and I'd go to war with Zell. But after I was ready to leave, and I told Governor Barnes, I said, I'm going to, cut out of here. And he said, well, how about staying through the session? So I did, and then left after.
Tell us about George Busby.
Well, I think the most embarrassed I've ever been in, but it tells you what kind of guy George Busby was. My son, who is now 32, was, let's see, he was born in 77. He was 3 when I got elected. And Tom Daniel invited us. I knew Tom had met him in another way, but he invited us to, of course, come over, and when we got sworn in, to come and meet Governor Busby. Well, that was, you know, that's huge when you're 28 years old and you're about to go meet the governor. Well, I had Griffin and my wife, and we get to the door, knock on, and you know, Busby opened the door, and Griffin looked up at him and said, "Hello, dummy," and took a flip, just did a flip right over in the office. Well, I was mortified, and my wife she nearly cried. And Busby just howled and picked Griffin up, and they played, because he had grandchildren, and they got to be buddies, and so they even, when I would bring Griffin over, Busby would want to see him. But he was, I really liked him, one of them, and he had a good way about it. Somebody described him, a guy with an iron fist with a velvet glove on. I mean, he could be tough. I remember Trulock and they had the budget before the Senate. You know, you never really fool with the budget. And they were trying to buy this parking lot over in front of the railroad depot. Paul and I thought that wasn't a good way to expend any money, so we put in a floor amendment to take it out. People like Culver, who loved to get in any kind of fight, they joined with us. And Paul got up in the well and said he smelled a rat, that there's something wrong. We didn't need to be buying that parking lot. And, well, we passed the amendment. Unbelievable. Well, it wasn't about an hour. Governor Busby called the two of us down there, and I mean, in no uncertain terms, he told us that was his project and that was his parking lot, and he didn't give a damn how we got it undone, but we'd better get it undone. And I don't know how we got the bill back up before he scared us to death, and we got that amendment put back in, and that's how the depot parking lot got purchased. And then another time, one of the real interesting things about Busby is Paul Brown. You remember the old Paul Brown? When Jimmy Carter got defeated and was coming home to Plains, the Senate was going to, you know, take people down there on various planes, and Paul Brown was in charge of getting up everybody to go down there. And well, he ran out. He told me I could go. Then somebody senior to me wanted to go, and he just came and said, "You're off the list. You can't go. You hadn't been here long enough. You know, just somebody else is going." Well, it made me mad, and I called Tom Daniel and I said, "You know how I might get down to Plains and see the president come home? Y'all got a plane going or a bus or something?" He said, "Sure." He said, Governor Busby's flying down there with him, and he said, "We're sending a plane to pick Governor up, so you just ride down there with him, and you can ride back with the governor." And so I went down on the governor's plane and rode in with a trooper. It was raining after that was over, and I was standing by Paul Brown, and he said, "How'd you get down here?" He said, I rode on the governor's plane." And then his trooper pulled up and got me and left Paul in the rain. And Governor Busby flew back, and the weather was bad. And I remember Miss Mary Beth sat there and she said, "George, I don't like this, but he had a state pilot up there, and we got back. But just a neat guy. I came up with this idea one time when he was governor to have the inmates refurbish school buses. And they have a program in Texas, and so I went out there and looked at that program, and they'd take a school bus at the end of its lifespan and send it to this prison garage, and for about $12,000 make it brand new instead of buying another $50,000. So anyway, so I started working on that, and I got a message that Governor Busby wanted to see me. So I go down there, because I, you know, politically naive. I went down and I said, walked in. He said, "How's your school bus project coming along?" I went to tell him all about it, and he said, "Well, we're not going to do that." I said, "We're not." I said, well, this sure does make a lot of sense. He said, no, we're not going to do that. He said, you probably don't know. He said, you ever heard of the Luces? I said, yes, sir. And I think I have. He said, well, they make school buses down in South Georgia. He said, they don't like this. And he said, they've been good supporters of mine. I said, okay. So that ended the school bus refurbishing, but always just a gentleman.
Very progressive governor.
Very progressive governor. Smart. I mean, he knew the budget. Just a delight to be around. I remember the great nights at the mansion. He and the speaker would get up and sing, and it wasn't so mean-spirited back then. And you really, and it was very impressionable for somebody 28, 29 years old to be in the